Mr. President, please be seated. The chamber is now back in session. The floor is given to Evidentiary defense team to put question to the expert. Mr. Chandler, you may proceed.
Good afternoon, Mr. President. Good afternoon, Your Honors, and good afternoon to everyone in and around the courtroom, and especially to you, Dr. Chandler. Along with Mr. Angodom, we represent Mr. Evidentiary. This morning I noticed a question was posed to you concerning the bombings in 1973, and at which point you stopped, you looked at the trial chamber, and you asked whether you would be permitted to go into that period. Though one could not help notice that you did not do that last week when you were asked questions by the prosecution concerning periods of 1960, which was outside the scope of the indictment. And of course, when the civil parties were questioning you concerning events in 1940s and 50s. So my question to you, Dr. Chandler, and there's no need to write this stuff down, I'm sure you can figure out the answer. Why was it necessary to seek permission from the trial chamber for the defense and not for the prosecution of the civil parties?
Thank you. My answer to that question is the questions dealing with material before 1975, to my recollection, I can stand corrected if not, all dealt with the history of the Communist Party of Cambodia, about which I've written extensively, and I think which is that history is relevant to my own expertise. I'm not an expert on the American bombing, and also important to the proceedings at this trial for both the prosecution and the defense. When the question came up of the American bombing, as you could see from the answer that I eventually gave, I was not reluctant to talk about this. This is a horrible event in American and Cambodian history. But I did feel this is a question bringing something else to the table, a foreign power that had not been discussed before, and I just wanted to make sure that this was not a diversion. I was told it wasn't, so I gave the answer I did.
Okay. Thank you. You could see, however, where it would be tempting for me to imagine that the purpose for you doing so is because you're here thinking perhaps most likely to assist the prosecution as opposed to being here to give objective evidence. That would be one way of looking at it, would it not?
I take a little offense at that. Frankly, I'm not that kind of a cynical person.
Let's talk about your context and about the sources that you looked at. This morning, you asked a series of questions. I'm going to follow up on some of those questions because I don't think they went deep enough. Could you please tell us exactly who it was that you had contact with prior to coming here to give your evidence? And I'm not speaking merely for this trial, but also for the other trial, for 001. And I'm speaking about individuals working for either the Office of the Prosecution or for the Office of the Co-Investigative Judges.
Hello. President, Mr. Expert, please wait. Wait until the chamber decides on the objection raised by the prosecution. Through the last question posed to you by the defense team for Evidentiary. International prosecutor, you may proceed.
I rose before my learned friend finished his question. We don't have a problem in principle with a question as specific as whether or not Professor Chandler has spoken to members of the prosecution or OCIJ about his testimony. But the questions need to be specific, and if that's the question, it can be asked. We have no objection to it being asked.
Mr. President, I will go from the general to the specific. First, I want to know with whom he spoke with. Did you have a chance to speak with Mr. Heder?
Yes, if email counts as speaking, I did.
Yes, it does count.
Okay, fair enough.
And how often have you contacted and exchanged emails with Mr. Heder?
You mean in this year or what?
From the moment he started working for this institution, because first he worked for the prosecution in drafting the introductory submission, then switched over to the investigative sector to see whether what he drafted was correct. So I want to know, as of when did you have contact with him? And I believe this institution began somewhere around the neighborhood of 2005, 2006.
Since his work was of interest to me, but it was not did not feed into any of my ongoing research. I think my contacts with him were quite irregular, mostly on a social basis, just trying to find out what kind of an event was happening here in Phnom Penh. As my testimony, the time for my testimony approached, I did not specifically approach him and ask him in any sense what I should do or what I should say, but I did as it came closer, I familiarized myself with more of the material that's readily available about the trial that I had not consulted in detail beforehand.
Now, was that for 001 as well as for 002? That is Doik was the first one. Is there a particular problem with my English? I see you pausing. Okay, sorry.
Okay, I did much less preparation for case 1, since that was largely about my book, which I reread in preparation for the trial. For this case, I had to restudy not only the books that I've read that have been decided here, but lots of other secondary material to try and be as helpful as I could be.
Dr. Chandler, stick with me. I'm speaking about your contacts with Heder. Did you have contacts with Heder concerning the Doik trial? Yes or no? If so, to what extent?
Very limited contact, but yes.
And with respect to this particular case, did you have any contact with Mr. Heder while he was working for the Office of the Prosecution? That is, while he was drafting the introductory submission along with the other team members of the prosecution?
Yes, I'm sure I did, but it wasn't to find out what was going on because I wasn't involved in the trial. It was just we exchanged documents about other parts of Cambodian history and stuff like that, but I wasn't seeking particular information from him at this time.
Let me make it very clear, Dr. Chandler. I am not suggesting that you were seeking any sort of information from him. Right now, I'm merely trying to establish if you had any contact with him, and if so, to what extent. And if documents were exchanged, that's something that does pique my interest. Could you please tell us what documents were brought to your attention by Dr. Heder during this period of time?
He directed me to much of his published material that I hadn't read, and that's mainly what he did. But yes, it was contact with him about at this time.
And the published material that he directed you to, was that related to, in part, what he was doing for the Office of the Prosecution at the time?
Not directly related. It had preceded this his role in the courts. He led me to the document cited this morning from 1999, I think it was. Led me to another thing he wrote at a somewhat later date, but not just specific court documents. I've never seen the court documents before I came here.
So would it be fair to say from that particular answer that he also provided you with primary sources of information, documents that he had available which had not been available or known to you?
No, that's not true. He did not give me any primary source material that was not available to me beforehand.
That was a question, not a statement.
Well, okay. Well, I mean, he did not. Yes, I mean, he did not provide me with such material. That's the answer to your question.
All right. Now, after Mr. Heder went over and started working with the Office of the Co-Investigative Judges, did you continue to have contacts with him? And if so, could you please tell us how those what those contacts were all about?
Well, it's difficult to tell you what the contacts were all about. There were frequent contacts between two colleagues who've been friends for 30 years. But let me say they were not about. They were not. Let me put it another way. These contacts did not involve any information that was not widely open. I was not trying to publish anything. I was not doing my own research. I talked to him about the progress of the trial to an extent. This was interesting to me. He said off the record, so I'm not going to put it on the record now.
I see. When he said he was off the record.
Mr. President, Counsel, could you please pause between the question and answer session in order to facilitate the interpretation through the system?
Apologies. When you say off the record, just let me make sure I understand. Are we to conclude that there were some discussions, exchanges of emails concerning his work that you consider off the record, and therefore you're not privy to discuss with us here today? Is that how we're to understand that answer?
He made it clear in some of these discussions that he didn't want me to write anything up. That's all. That's what I understood to mean off the record, and I never did write anything up from these discussions.
Right. But what he didn't want you
don't you have to have that translated? I'm not sure.
Okay, well, he did not want you to write up anything about it. Can I conclude that he was writing or he was researching or he was drafting something for the Office of the Core Investigative Judges, which is why he was having this sort of private communication with you, which you feel today you are not privy to discuss in the public?
Your Honor.
The President, Mr. Expert, please wait. We wait to hear the objection raised by the prosecution first to the last question put to you by the defense team for Evidentiary. The prosecution, you may proceed.
Our objection is in relevance, Your Honours. We had assumed that where counsel was going was to ask questions that might elicit responses relevant to Professor Chandler's studies, and questions along those lines we wouldn't object to. But counsel seems to now be turning to a impromptu inquiry into what information staff of the co-investigating judge's office considered on or off the record in their communication with other people. This is completely irrelevant. If counsel wishes to ask Professor Chandler what information he was provided, what information he considered informing his opinion, then that is appropriate. Going into other people's work and attempting to conduct an inquiry into other individuals who are not here testifying today is irrelevant and inappropriate.
let me briefly respond, Mr. President. If, in fact, Heder was working for the Office of the Co-Investigative Judges, first and foremost, he had no business discussing that business, what he was doing, with anyone else. That should have been within the Office of the Co-Investigative Judges, unless perhaps I'm mistaken how this system is supposed to work. That's first and foremost. Second of all, Heder is a historian. As we've indicated, he worked for the prosecution. He then worked for the co-investigative judges. If, in fact, Heder now is talking to Chandler, and Chandler knows he's going to be testifying, as Heder would have known that he would be testifying, then we have a problem. And that's why I'm entitled to go into this, especially since, as of last week, we've heard testimony from Professor Chandler that he has, in some ways, shifted his position. Now, today he says what he received and what he has learned has been more for amplification purposes as opposed to revelation. But nonetheless, we're entitled to explore that because it goes to the gentleman's credibility. And that's why I think I should be permitted to have this discussion, because it wasn't just Heder, it was also Etchison, and there was also Lacard. They were working for the Office of the Co-Prosecutors. So, and we're not suggesting that Professor Chandler was doing anything inappropriate, but certainly if members of the prosecution or if members of the co-investigative judges are reaching out to potential witnesses and are having discussions concerning this case and are showing them documents, that it could lead us into a problem to thinking that perhaps those working in those institutions might be gaming the process.
President. The Chamber wishes to cede the floor to Judge Lavergne to rule on the objection and the question by counsel by Mr. Evidentiary. Judge Lavergne, you may now proceed.
Oui. Thank you, Mr. President. The Chamber would like to draw Counsel Carnivus's attention to the fact that what we are interested in today is accusations levelled against the accused in case 002, and more precisely to review what is relevant in terms of the facts covered in the first trial in case number 2. Other issues that may concern the way in which the investigation may have been conducted in case 001 is irrelevant, and that line of questioning will not be authorized by the Chamber because it seems to be lacking in all pertinence, and therefore the Chamber would like you to focus your questions on those that are relevant to probative matters in case 002. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Judge Laverne. For the record, a witness's credibility is always pertinent, at least in the Anglo-Saxon system. Now, you indicated that you had looked at the closing order. Can you please tell us whether you read the entire closing order or just sections of the closing order?
I read the text of the closing order, and I should make it clear, it was not clear for a little bit from one of your earlier questions. I had never seen any of this closing order before I came to Phnom Penh last week. I asked for it to be shown it. This was a legitimate request. I was shown it to give me background, get me up to speed on where the things were. No, I did not read all the footnotes. I've been asked that. I checked footnotes when there was something that looked to me like, where did this come from? Sometimes I couldn't think it. And that's it. That's what I want to say.
All right, so let me make sure that I have your testimony correct. When you came to Phnom Penh to testify was when the first time that you were provided with the closing order.
Yes.
Now, was that a hard copy or an electronic copy?
Hard copy.
And when you did look at the footnotes, to go to the original sources that are cited in the footnotes, it's my understanding you had a very limited access to those documents, correct? What's cited in the footnotes?
I had no access to any of the documents. I was familiar with some of them, but I did not have access to them in Phnom Penh when I was reading the document.
And prior to coming to Phnom Penh, I understand that you were provided with some documents from the trial chamber to review. You were informed that the parties would want you to look at certain documents. Is that correct?
Yes.
Aside from those documents, did you look at any other documents? And let me specify original source documents.
I would have to say no to that. If you mean original source in Khmer, I did not do any research in Khmer for this appearance.
All right. Well, what if they were translated into English? I guess what I'm trying to do is exclude academic journals, text, and what have you. So other than the documents that were provided to you, which we have a list of, I would like to know whether you looked at other primary source documents, not necessarily in Khmer, that might have been translated.
the things I looked at outside of those documents were printed sources produced by the study of the the tribunal by John Chut Carey that's been published. The 7 candidates for prosecution that came out several years ago. I read that. I had read that before, but so I went back to it. I read that years ago. Some of these printed things I just went around. I couldn't read them all. I had 2 weeks' notice, and I wanted to concentrate on the documents sent to me by the court.
And the 7 candidates for prosecution, that's by header, where he names the accused, among others. Correct?
Yes, that's right.
Now, last week you indicated on several occasions, and we will probably get into that tomorrow, that having read the closing order, it was, I don't want to say a constant, but it was certainly a repeated refrain. Having read the closing order, you had reached certain conclusions, or you wanted to adjust your thinking or your positions. Having heard what you just told us now, can we assume, since you've told us you did not have access to the documents that were in support of the closing order, other than that was provided to you by the trial chamber, that when you say, having read the closing order, you're talking about the text of the closing order?
That's right.
In other words, and I'm not trying to pin you down, and certainly not trying to ascribe blame in any way, although it may appear that way. This is the process of asking questions in court. It is, I understand, uncomfortable. You're relying on the text as opposed to doing a due diligence to actually look at the documents that's being cited and to see whether what is cited is indeed correct, accurate, complete, and in support of that, the assertions made in the closing order.
Well, thank you. Thank you for smiling back there. That was welcome. Okay, one thing to correct your wording slightly. I never said that I'd reached new conclusions or adjusted my thinking. I never said that. I said new information came my way, which was interesting, that I wished I'd been able to cite. I said this morning this would supplement some of the statements I made in other books. Cited the Sihanouk letter, for example, about the conversation with Pol Pot. That was a revelation to me. I would love to have folded that into my book. So please don't say that I said things that I didn't say, such as changed my thinking. Things I did not say that. The closing order did not change my thinking. I'm getting a bit aggressive. I'm sorry. Second thing, there was no way, I think, that I could have conducted due diligence on documents when I was in my hotel room in Phnom Penh. So I didn't. I agree that I did not. I did not have the occasion to do so. I don't think that forbade me from finishing the document, finishing reading the document for information purposes.
Well, first, let me apologize if I misquoted you, although it wasn't a quote. I was trying to paraphrase, and if I got it wrong, I certainly appreciate you correcting me, and please do so on each and every occasion, and I will endeavor to be as accurate as possible. And secondly, let me point out that I'm not suggesting that you should have done a due diligence. I just merely wish to make sure I understand you, that when you say based on the closing order we now know, you're referring to the text of the closing order as opposed to the text plus footnotes, having done a due diligence on the footnotes to see whether it is supportive actually of what is being asserted in the closing order. So I think we are in agreement. Is that correct?
Yes, I think we are, the way you stated it. Yes, you are. We are.
Thank you very much. And I'll try to smile a little more to make it go easier. If I could take you back a little bit to that period that was referenced earlier this morning on the U.S. bombing, and not that I want to belabor the point, and it's not for purposes of justification, but merely for historical context, because I think you would agree with me, would you not, Professor Chandler, that context is pretty important when we're trying to understand historical events, albeit in a court of law. Would you agree with me on that?
Certainly.
So, for contextual purposes, could you please tell us on or about what year did the bombing begin in Cambodia? You talked about 1973, but it happened several years earlier. It started, that is. Correct?
Yes, and I mentioned the earlier bombings in my statement this morning. Began in 1967.
Right. Now, I'm merely trying to make a record.
Yeah, no, fair enough.
I have to go through some background. So if you could be patient with me, and I appreciate the frustration that you must be feeling. But there must have been a reason why this bombing was occurring. Can you please tell us why the U.S. was bombing Cambodia?
I really can't believe as an American you need an answer to that, but I will give it for the court. The Americans were bombing Cambodia as support of their war against the North Vietnamese and NLF forces fighting in southern Vietnam. That's the answer to that. This was it was not the bombing of Cambodia per se. It was an element of the war against Vietnam, which the Vietnamese, for example, did not refer to as the Vietnam War, but a total war against the Americans wherever it took place.
Thank you. We're trying to make a record.
Sure.
So just bear with me. And I apologize if some of my questions seem simple. Now, before the bombing occurred, or started that is, can you please describe to us the context a little bit? Sihanouk, as I understand it, was the head of state. And could you please tell us what was happening in Cambodia that would motivate the Americans to bomb Cambodia?
Nothing was happening in the Cambodian government or visible to the rest of the world that would let the Americans bomb Cambodia. What they were bombing, or hoped they were bombing, and in many cases succeeded, was the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which ran through Cambodia from North Vietnam and Laos into southern Vietnam.
And when you say the Ho Chi Minh Trail, are you speaking about Sihanouk having made arrangements with China to allow weapons to go through Cambodia to assist the North Vietnamese communists who were at the time, fighting the South? Is that what you're talking about?
For the sequence, I'd have to get back to my book. I have written about this. Yes, this was certainly connected. Sihanouk, the phrase frequently and I think accurately used about him is balancing act. Bit of this, bit of that, bit of this, bit of that. Play to the Chinese, then play to the Americans. He renewed when the war was going badly that's not the right way to put it. 1968, he feared that having broken relations with the Americans in 1964 may have been a mistake. So he resumed relations. And it seems from the evidence, this is not entirely certain, but it seems that a quid pro quo for renewing American diplomatic relations was to continue the bombing along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. That's and I think it's part of the public record. Sihanouk has said, if you kill Cambodians, I'll go public. If you don't, I won't. Because he didn't care what happened in the jungle or what happened to Vietnamese troops. In that sense, it was a reaction to Sihanouk.
All right. And politically, I mean, as a historian, did you also study the politics in Cambodia at that period of time and what Sihanouk may have been doing to his political opponents?
Yeah, there's a whole chapter in my book about that last phases of Sihanouk's time in office when he was very severe with his opponents. We heard that bit of that in some of the previous discussion on Samlot, where it was put down very brutally. If he had not been harsh with his opponents, Mr. Khieu Samphan, Mr. Ieng Sary would not have fled to the countryside, and so on. I mean, yes, I've written about this. It's well known.
And if you could tell us a little bit, you told us that there's bombing. We know a little bit about what's happening in Phnom Penh, but outside in the countryside, how is that affecting, or please describe to us, I should say, what it must have been like for the average Cambodian living outside in the rural area, if there is such a thing as an average Cambodian.
That's a question I wish I could answer better than I will, but certainly in areas along the border, it was pretty difficult for these people who had Vietnamese soldiers stationed among them who behaved, as all records show, they behaved very, very well, actually, as it turns out, but that was difficult, particularly after the Tet Offensive, which was of February 1968, which was launched from Cambodia. People know that. It was launched from bases here in Cambodia into South Vietnam, and as soon as that failed, which it did except for public relations purposes, a lot of those forces were mown down, and the North Vietnamese forces came into the border areas as opposed to the kind of NLF Southern Vietnamese people who had always been there for years, often since the 1950s. So it gets a lot harsher when the North Vietnamese get in there. The fighting gets worse. The war's going more, it's getting more questionable for Sihanouk. Also, his own political base is getting unsteady. The assembly elected in 1966 was the only one that had been elected without his hand-picking the candidates. So these candidates who were elected were not his people. A few were, but not all of them. So he's getting nervous, and this is I've documented this. And there's so many things going on at once. There's a growing resistance to his rule. There's growing discontent in the towns among people. The economy is not going that well. In the countryside, there are people who are being pulled toward the war. It's a complicated but unpleasant situation, as you suggested.
All right, and this continues on for some period, and then we know in 1970 there is the coup, but the bombings continue all the way, as you indicated this morning. They were going on in 1973. Do you know by that point how the bombings would have, what impact it had on the countryside? We're talking about the physical impact, that is, villages, farming, that's livestock. If you could help us out on that.
That's a question I answered rather poorly this morning, and I can't answer any better now because I wasn't out there and I don't have evidence. I said in a document that I think this previous council had cited must have been catastrophic, and I still stand by that. But I don't know how catastrophic, how worse, in some places better in others. But still, I should not correct, but amplify a little bit. In 1970, 71, and 72, the bombing continued to be along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. 73 was the shift to bombing populated areas, and that's the bombing that people usually talk about. That's the outright bombardment of the Ring of Fire around Phnom Penh that I mentioned this morning. So, I mean, I would say it must have been catastrophic, but I don't have first-hand evidence. I haven't talked to anyone who was in one of those villages and so on. So that's all I can say.
All right. Now, aside from the physical impact, as a historian, having met with various individuals out there interviewing and what have you, are you able to tell us the psychological impact that it might have had or would have had on those people. I see that there's an objection, Dr. Chandler, so please wait.
The President. Dr. Chandler, could you hold on? We wait until we hear from counsel for the sole parties. Counsel, you may proceed.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. I am objecting to the question that has just been asked regarding the assessment of the psychological impact, and I would like to refer to your jurisprudence of yesterday. Yesterday you stated that Mr. Chandler is not competent to answer any questions of a psychological nature.
If I may, Mr. President, and we might get into that at some point, but I'm not asking for a psychoanalysis. If he has met with individuals and they describe to him what it was like living and the impact it had on their lives, that's what I'm asking for. I'm not asking whether it caused any mental illnesses to any of those individuals. So I think in that limited context, if the gentleman has an answer, that's what I'm seeking from him.
The President. Dr. Chandler, you may respond to the rephrased question.
I can only repeat my previous answer. I said I'd not spoken to these people, but the effects must have been catastrophic in many places. I mean, you can qualify further on, but I would say must have been. I'll stick with that wording.
Thank you. Now, on 20 July 2012, on page 98, and this is a draft transcript, you said the following. Let me read it. I'll go slowly, and I can provide you with a hard copy, but there's no dilemma here. You indicate, starting at line 12, on page 98 of the English version, rural populations were told that American bombers were coming from Phnom Penh. So people, there's lots of evidence of this, the forces that entered Phnom Penh and some of the forces that entered from Battambang were extremely angry. They had been told to be angry. They'd been told that this was a place that was not just a Western American, but a place that was out to destroy them, the cities. And so the cities were the place of new people who were also, just by definition, people who had not taken part in the revolution, which makes them, in Khmer Rouge's thinking, not us, but them. In other words, enemies. Now, my question to you, sir, is this. The people that were being bombed and their villages destroyed, their cattle and their children maimed and killed, were they aware, based on your historical studies, were they aware that those bombs were American bombs?
I can't directly answer that question because I wasn't there, of course. But it seems to me they were told when Khmer Rouge forces could be in contact with these people, they told them the fact that these were American bombs. They didn't tell them that they were anything but that they weren't.
And were they aware that the government of Cambodia, both under Sihanouk and then under Lanol, was allowing the American government to bomb those areas? Were they aware of that, based on your historical studies?
The President, Dr. Chandler, could you please hold on? International Co-Prosecutor is now on his feet. He may proceed first.
Our objection is simple, Mr. President. The question seeks to elicit speculation on the part of the professor as to the state of mind of the people in liberated areas in 1975. It's not an issue on which the expert can be expected to opine. The question can be rephrased. Is there evidence of information being given to cadre about A, B, and C?
I'm perfectly happy to rephrase. You told us that the bombing started somewhere in 1967 and it continued for approximately 6 years. You told us that that folks would have known that the bombing was by the Americans. Do you know whether during this period the people of Cambodia outside of Phnom Penh would have known that the governments of Cambodia under Sihanouk and Lenol were in line with the United States?
I mean, it's a matter of how they would have known and which ones would have known. People who were told this would have known. People who weren't informed probably wouldn't have guessed that the government was tied up with the Americans. This was certainly you can call it propaganda, but it was, which it was, but it was also a very valuable tool of the Khmer Rouge to explain that the betrayal of the government, what they saw as the betrayal of the government that allowed such bombing to take place. I want once again to re-clarify and back off a bit on I don't want to leave the impression in the record that the bombing of Cambodia, the blanket bombing of Cambodia in 1973 had been unabated from 1967. I think a lot of people in Cambodia didn't know there was bombing going on from 67 to 70, really. It was the far northeast, particularly. The trail ran through some very heavily forested, unpopulated areas. If we're talking about 73, I think that this is already after the Vietnamese have withdrawn their support from the Khmer Rouge. The ceasefire with America has happened. The Khmer Rouge are starting to take command of their half of the Civil War, which they had not had command of before. And one of their weapons, psychological weapons, was to tell as many people as they could reach that these bombs were American, that they were being directed at them but this is a thing that was the only untruth, was they were being directed from, the planes were flying out of Phnom Penh. In other words, they were their own city. In fact, those planes couldn't have taken off from Phnom Penh. People didn't know that. Your own government is letting these planes fly out of Phnom Penh.
That's a minor detail, though, whether they were flying out of Phnom Penh or whether they were flying out of Guam. You would agree, would you not, that the bombs were landing in Cambodia on those villages, killing those people? If you could answer the question, the mic wasn't on, sir.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to seem crass, but it seems to be a very effective piece of tactic to put this idea in people's heads, which was very hard to absorb, that their own government was helping to bomb them. Foreigners bothering Cambodia has been in their history for centuries. So that part of it was, okay, another set of foreigners. But in cahoots with the people, your own people, this would have, I think, really increased the anger. I'm guessing again, but I'm sure it would have made people angrier than they would have been if it was just foreigners for no apparent reason, like a typhoon, having an effect on the countryside.
Of course, that was the truth, though, wasn't it? Wasn't the Cambodian government allowing the U.S. to ravage the Cambodian countryside through bombings? It wasn't that they were giving them misinformation. That was the truth, was it not? You as an American should know that.
I guess it's not a leading question. You lead me back to something I've said already. I have said this already, that what you're suggesting, I'm not leading in any other direction. And I certainly don't want to detract from the what I've said must have been catastrophic suffering that was involved here, but I'm answering the questions as best I can otherwise.
All right. If we could move on to another area, since the notion of psychoanalysis came up, I want to look at passages from your book, Brother Number One, certain phrases, and perhaps you could help us out here. So if we could, I'm referring to E3/17, and you could provide you with a copy of this material, unless you have the book itself, the revised edition. I'm referring to page 9, and the ERN number is 00392923. The Khmer version is 00821673, and I don't believe that this has been translated into French. Our apologies. I will just pick out some of these phrases in this book. Here on this particular page you say, Tsar must have been traumatized by the solemn discipline of the monastery. Now, here you seem to be trying to psychoanalyze Pol Pot, are you not?
I prefer the word understand, but yes, it has psychological implications, certainly.
Okay. And I'm going to read a few others, and then let you give one more or less global answer at some point. On page 10, the following page, which in Khmer would be 00821674, and in English it's 00392924, you say, it is easy to imagine Solasar in the 1930s huddled at the edge of the stage watching the masked and powdered dancers trained by his cousin, and perhaps including his sister and his brother's wife, performed by the light of hundreds of candles and the moon. You go on to say that the following, the next page, Khmer 00821675, page 12 in English, or 00392926. It is impossible to say which impression of the palace prevailed among Salazar's memoirs once he came to power. You then go on to say, he may have been thinking about the dancers, or about the peasants he encountered later on. He may have been thinking of his own uprooted childhood in a potentially hostile city. The next passage, which would be on page 15 in English, the Khmer is 00821678, or 00392929. More important, this affectionate family, orderly domestic life, and insulation from poverty may have helped to produce a deceptively smooth psychological surface and equanimity that impressed observers for the rest of his career. Khmer ERN number 00821682, page 19 English, or 00392926. application for fairness, it is tempting to see Van Sivan as the first of several role models he chose to emulate. Next, Khmer 00821688. There's a
The President, the prosecution, you may proceed.
I hate to break up my learned friend's rhythm, but I think by now we've all forgotten the first point. We've got to break it up into manageable components. I think there might be a point that is coming, but I think that point can be made in 2 or 3 points. I think we're expecting the professor to, as it were, be able to bring all of this together and respond to your questions. It's just too much. The question will be too complex and difficult to answer. It won't help the court.
Mr. President, the professor wrote these quite eloquent passages, and he is a historian. There was an objection about psychoanalysis. At some point, I wish to ask the gentleman whether this is the way historians write, or is this some sort of a historical novel, or is he taking literary license, poetic license in writing, as opposed to providing an actual historical account of brother number one. That's the thrust of the purpose behind pointing out these very eloquent passages in Professor Chandler's book, Brother Number One. Just from the passages, we may get some more of the vignettes, but just from the passages that we just read out. First of all, you would agree with me that they can't be found in the book, and they're not. Would you like to see them?
What am I like to go on? No, I know they're in my book.
Yeah. I just need to make sure that we're all on the same page. Work with me, Dr. Sandler. I know you can be frustrated. But when you say it's tempting to imagine, and then you go on to psychoanalyze, is this because you're trying to make history sort of a popular read, as opposed to writing history?
Of course, I don't really like the implication. It's been said several times in the court that history is some sort of unreadable pile of junk. This is a biography. The key point of this book, I think, the key point of the book is a biography. The purpose of the biography was not to write a chronological history or chronological record of Pol Pot's life, a CV, if you like, which I could have done. It would have covered about 2 pages. But to try and understand not only the person from what we knew about his life, but also the person we discovered from the effect he had on people who met him. I, of course, never interviewed him. For example, I knew people who had been to the same school with him in Kompong Cham talked about this Professor Kwan Sipan as a very inspiring figure, and that Hunim was there because it was the same school. So I had evidence that this man had been very inspiring and forthright. Before that, Pol Pot had been in more or less French schools, not been had a teacher that he ever mentioned. Secondly, the business of his smooth outer appearance, that's the first thing anybody who ever met him said to me about him. That's almost for the sake of it. They would rub their arm to show how smooth his skin was. This was a character who had a smooth outer exterior. Photographs reveal that. So I was trying to say that coming perhaps from such a comfortable, close family might have given him a, if you like, a persona that could act this way. Now, yes, they are trying to make it readable, but it's not the same. This was a biographical experiment. I didn't make those excursions in my other books that I know of. I didn't try to say what was in Duke's mind, for example. I've seen it sometimes, but not as much. I was trying to get not inside, but get toward an understanding of a person who was and remains very mysterious to me. And you have to do some guesswork to try and put light on it. And I think I'm just closing. I think in the preface I mentioned, I often have the feeling that he was in the room looking at me. I wasn't looking at him. I couldn't find him. He was behind me somewhere. Because he's so unattainable in a way. Which is, yeah, good.
Well, I certainly hope I have not given the impression that my history should be dull or a bunch of junk. We do appreciate your fine writing. But let me go on one more passage, and then I'll move on to my next topic. At some point, you seem to be speculating as to what you might have read when you say, talk about various books by Stalin and what have you, and you say, it is likely that by 1952, Tsar received most of his news and formed many of his opinions from journals produced by the French Communist Party. And then you go on, he would also have been familiar with Stalin's writing, especially his widely circulated history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And then you go on to say, it is tempting to picture Solosong working through these turgid materials by dim light, absorbing the view of the world that emphasize conspiracies, empowerment, vigilance, and clandestinity. It would probably be misleading, however, to endow his activities at this stage with too much coherence or ambition. And I was just reading from Khmer 00821695, English page 32 or 00893946. And my question, Dr. Chandler, is are you not here speculating that he would have read this material, setting aside your phrase that it is tempting to do this, tempting to picture him as this, setting that phrase aside, are you not, as a historian, taking liberties and making assumptions?
You have to take some and some, and if they're illegitimate, it's right to object to them. My material on his reading comes from several interviews with former people who belonged to the French Communist Party at that time, French Communist Party histories, which I studied for my work on Pol Pot. The atmosphere he was in the country with the most Stalinist regime, even it was more Stalinist than the regimes even that had communist governments. This was a very dogmatic communist party. And what you had to do every day was to read L'Humanité, their paper. All members read the paper. And if they didn't, they were, I don't know what punishment happened, but you had to do that. Stalin's history of the Soviet Party, of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, CPSU, was also required reading at party meetings. They had to study this text. So I assumed that Pol Pot had done some of the things that other French communists were doing because he was a member of the party. Now that might be a stretch, but I don't think so. As for the dim light, we've located his apartment, and in 1990, this was one of the most dimly lit places I've ever seen. Now, he may have had a good light in 1950, but I doubt it. It's a funny little garret on top of a bar in the 15th London Mall.
Thank you, Dr. Chandler.
sorry, I spilled some water, but I heard your question. The answer is yes.
Okay. And so barring having what you call the proverbial smoking gun, there are times when you need to make certain assumptions based on the available evidence that you have. But can I ask you, at least in your experience or having viewed others, do you think that historians sometimes just get it wrong because they made assumptions or maybe assuming a bit too much based on the evidence available to them?
Certainly, that's a great risk that historians face.
Okay. Now the next topic I want to discuss a little bit is some of your figures that you've come up with as far as the death toll during this period. And the reason I want to do so is because having looked at a variety of things that you have published in the past, I don't want to say your position has shifted, but let's just say the numbers often seem to be slightly different, if I can put it that way. Before we go into the actual numbers, can you please tell us what is your estimation of the number of people that were killed prior to the fall of Phnom Penh, prior to April 1975? And let's just say we'll pick a window between the starting of the bombings and slightly thereafter all the way until 75. You have a figure in mind.
I've seen a figure of 500,000, but that was not based on my research. There may be higher figures. That's a good question, however.
All right. Now, when you say you saw a figure, was this by a demographer or was this by a historian or journalist or a combination?
Well, this is by a demographer, certainly. This is not a figure guessed at by a journalist that I cited.
Okay. Now, when you say demographer, do you have one in mind? I hate to pin you down.
I mean, you're taking my pauses for reluctance. It's really because of the light. Here you go. I have no reluctance to answer that question. The two books, one is Le Génocide des Khmer Rouges, is by a man with a Polish name. I forget, Slawinski, I think. And the other is by a man called Patrick Uvelin, who wrote a very good article on and this figure that I think appeared in one or both of those published documents. That's why I agree.
All right. And in reading those articles, did you check by any chance the sources that they used in coming up with that figure?
I looked at what they cited, but I had no way of verifying it. I respected these two scholars, so I have to put it that way.
You respected them because of their reputation, or was it because of the journal in which they had published, or because you had heard of them, or a combination of all three?
Just the level of detail in their arguments and their professional qualifications.
Do you know if a census had been done prior to 75, and if so, when was the last census for Cambodia, and what was the number?
I'm certain the last full census was in 1962. The exact figure, it was in those sources I cited, but they're not in front of me, what the population of Cambodia was at that time. This is often used as a base figure for later population figures. I think it was 6 million, but that doesn't make me the authority who said that.
All right, and do you know what census figures these two demographers would have picked for that period, 70 to 75, as a starting point, and then from there, deducting or concluding that up to 500,000 would have perished.
This occurred to me they were also being able to cite the work of another demographer called Migozzi, who wrote in French about this period. I haven't been in touch with that book for many years, but I know that was one of the things. He extrapolated some of these population figures in what struck me as a fairly professional fashion, so I went along with that.
All right. And have you read his work by any chance? The gentleman that you just cited, the French demographer.
Yes, I did. Long ago now, but yes, I did.
And was that a book that you used in coming up with your own figures, or were you relying more or less on what others had been writing about as far as the death toll?
I don't have any demographic talents, so I have to rely on these other people.
Right. And that's one of the reasons why I'm asking. Now, we put together a chart, and we'll make it available. We have it also in Khmer. I should note to the crowd chamber that we just put this together. We have all the source material, although some of the source material is not on the case file, although it is by Dr. Chandler. And we're not trying to get the material on, but for illustrative purposes, we want to show the different positions that Dr. Chandler has, or the different numbers he's come up with on different occasions. And because it involves several different documents, we have no objections, Your Honor, to allowing Dr. Chandler to have this chart, a copy of the material for him to look over, and then we can get to that area and get to that tomorrow morning first thing, if that would be convenient for Dr. Chandler. But I'm in your hands.
Mr. President, under my feet, just to request that if such a document is to be given to Professor Chandler, it should be given to all the parties in the chamber, and it should refer to the original documents from which these figures are sourced. In that case, we have no objection if those conditions that you require this year.
Absolutely. We certainly think that everybody should have be provided with a copy, and we apologize for not thinking of providing a hard copy to everyone. We can provide, perhaps, Mr. President, we can provide you with hard copies. Notice that we forgot the French. I think French will probably, although we do have a French lawyer working with us, so we're trying to cover that base as well. Perhaps what we can do is we'll revisit this in the morning. We'll try to provide this information to you, before we leave today, and before you leave the premises today, so you'll have them gone first thing in the morning.
Counsel, could you provide a detailed specification of the document ID of the document that you intend to show expert? And whether have you submitted a request for the document to be placed on the case file? And whether the chamber has decided on its perspectives or attempts to show the document to the professor and other parties for the sole purpose of the proceeding tomorrow morning, could provide the details of such a document for the chamber to consider whether the document will be accepted per the proceedings and procedures practiced at ECCC.
First, let me make sure that perhaps I was inarticulate when put my position forward. we have looked at various documents, some which are on the file, some which are not, that Dr. Chandler has generated. From that, we have come up with a chart to illustrate the point, to guide us through. The documents that we are referring to is, I can give you the error number of a document that's not in the file. Professor Chandler's Facing the Cambodian Past. Its error number in English is 00822745 and 00822754. Then we have an excerpt from Tragedy of Cambodian History, and this is the 93 edition. And this I believe we do have a French number on this one, but the English is 00193077, and French is 00824486. And then again, in the same document, in the introduction, there's 00193084. Then on page 236, which is 00193319, and then again, page 271, 00193354. So that's from David Chandler's book, Tragedy of Cambodian History, Politics, War, and Revolution. And this, as I indicated, was the 93, printed in 94. There is another document which is not on the file. It's called Epitaph for the Khmer Rouge. It's in the New Left Review, published May to June 1994. We have it in all three languages. Khmer is 00820894. English 00813915. And French 00823369. Then there's Voices from S21. This is already in. It's D108/39/2. And this is the 1999 edition. And it's Khmer 00191825. English 00192672. French 00357259. Then there's Brother number 1, and this is the 1992 version. The pages are Khmer 00821668, English 00818412. Then there's Brother number 1 again. This is the 1999 version. I have the Khmer, the English air number is 00392918. There's an article from in the Ethics in International Affairs Annual Journal, Carnegie Council on Ethics in International Affairs. article by Dr. Chandler, will there be a trial for the Khmer Rouge? This is not in evidence. It's in the file, but it has been provided. Everyone should have it. And the pages are Khmer.
The President's Council, I think we are confused now that as the President I am ambivalent as to what you are doing now, because we wish to know the documents you would like to put before the chamber or presented to the witness and parties to the proceeding. May we know whether the documents intended to be put before the chamber have already been placed or before the chamber for this purpose? And you indicated that the documents, some of which are already on the file, while the other are not yet on the file. You referred to documents ER numbers. Could you please be more precise as to whether the ER is in French, in Khmer, or in English? We believe that parties have already been well informed of how to proceed with the filing of documents. And indeed, if the documents are of new nature, then they shall, the rule of Rule 87 subparagraph 4 shall be applied. Whether the documents will be allowed for examination or not. And at the same time, counsel is advised to advise the chamber whether the documents have already been on the file proposed by another party. By doing so, we believe that we can save a lot of time and that we are less inconvenient. So please, counsel, be prepared on that, and you, by doing so, you would be brief, and that we will be certain as to the identification of the document, in particular the documents meant to be put before the chamber for tomorrow examination. Judge Silverkachai, you may also add some further point for the sake of clarification, so that counsel is fully informed and that the chamber has the ground for our discussion or decision for tomorrow's session.
Thank you, President. Mr. Carnabas, you've read out an extremely long list of documents. Before you can use them tomorrow, the chamber must know whether those documents are on the case file and whether they have been put before the chamber. Because, as you are well aware, the chamber's consistent ruling is that if they have not been put before the chamber, then a Rule 87.4 application must be filed in writing. So I think the chamber wishes to interrupt this very long rehearsal of documents so that we can get to the ones that can be used validly in putting questions to this expert. And I suspect that the President would want that information before you begin tomorrow morning, and you can anticipate the Chamber's ruling if the documents have not been put before the Chamber. But you must make a Rule 87.4 application. Placing them on the daily trial file is not sufficient. Thank you.
Just one point of clarification. Well, we will revise our little chart to reflect all of that, Your Honors. Assuming that the document has not been placed on the file, can we nonetheless pose a question to Professor Chandler that elsewhere, for instance, you have noted that it's 0.13 million as opposed to 1.5 or 1.7 or 1 in 8 as opposed to 1 in 7. Would we be allowed to do that if the purpose is to get the gentleman to testify as to what he has written in the past? That's why I laid the foundation concerning these numbers and demography. Then I don't see the problem in simply asking him whether he has had different numbers on different occasions and give him an opportunity to explain. But I'm in your hands.
Yes, thank you, President. As the Chamber has ruled previously, you may use documents that have not been put before the Chamber as a means of, as the basis for putting questions to the expert, but you may not identify the documents, or else we simply have to go through the whole process of authentication, distribution, and all of those issues, giving adequate notice to the parties. So you may use them as the basis for putting questions, no more than that. I know it's subtle, but this is the situation we are in with the huge numbers of documents that the trial chamber is faced with, and of course the parties are faced with as well. And it would be preferable if you would give us your little chart today, rather than spend time on it before we begin questioning the witness, the expert in the morning, before you return to questioning the expert in the morning. Thank you.
I know it's late, and I fully understand. The chart, in light of your ruling, I will need to revise it, because now, in light of the ruling, I see that perhaps it needs a little bit of revision. But another point of clarification, to be fair to the parties, fair to Dr. Chandler, without putting something in, would we be permitted to at least have a physical copy in the event that Dr. Chandler wished to see whether in fact this is the figure that he put down? I know this is subtle, but I'm trying.
No. The short answer is you would still need to make an application to put that document before the chamber and have argument on it at a later stage. Thank you.
President International for Prosecutor.
In the interest of cooperation among all the parties, we've been looking through the various filings, and Council's application E172/24/3 refers to, as far as we can tell, at least two of the documents. That was an 87-4 application, so at least two of the documents have already been the subject of an application. That was E172/24/3, and then Council also made a second application, E172/24/5, which doesn't seem to relate to the documents being cited now, but I just wanted to share those for everyone's benefit.
it is now appropriate for the adjournment. Nonetheless, Counsel for Ingsari already raised some documents to be put for examination before us during tomorrow's sessions. And due to the fact that there is a late submission of the lists of documents, the Chamber therefore rules that the Counsel for Ingsari prepare the list of the documents to be provided to the Chamber through the graphics before the commencement of tomorrow's session. Thank you very much.